Let's warmly welcome our second speaker, Mr. Shih-Feng Shen from Taiwan, who is set to graduate from the TIGP Biodiversity Program this month. His research revolves around exploring how behavior influences species interactions in dynamic thermal environments. He has been guided and supervised by Dr. Sheng-Feng Shen from Biodiversity Research Center, Academia Sinica.
Thank you for the introduction. I study the joint influence of climate change and land use change on biodiversity, with particular emphasis on the effects of temperature. As we all know that these two kinds of biodiversity stressor can influence the temperature experienced by many different species. The changes in temperature not only affects the survival and reproduction of different individual species, they also modulate the interaction between these different species. So therefore, this is the reason why I would like to investigate the effect of temperature on interaction between species. When we are talking about the effect of land use change and climate change, these two biodiversity stressors do not act in isolation. When we are talking about the joint influence of land use change and climate change, at the first moment we'll think that the effect is additive. That means that joint effect is simply the sum of each different stressor. However, in reality, we more often see the synergistic effect, which means that the joint influence is more than the sum of the two. And then occasionally we can also see some antagonistic effect. That means the joint influence is smaller than the sum. So my main question is about why this kind of synergistic effect will occur. I would like to explore the potential underlying mechanism of how this synergistic effects affect the interaction between different species. And since my study is about the interaction between species, it often involves complex behavioral responses of each individual species. So I would like to tackle the question from the angle of behavioral ecology. And then I propose two hypotheses to answer the question. The first is that land use changes reduce the availability of habitats with suitable microclimate. We can easily imagine that in an intact forest habitat, the temperature is relatively low. However, if land use change happens, here the land use change means deforestation. In the deforested habitat, the temperature may become high. However, even in the remaining forest patch, the temperature will also become high and unsuitable for some organisms because of the increase of forest age. The alternative hypothesis is that land use change may prevent the behaviors essential for organisms to cope with competition under extreme environment. Here I focus on the group living behavior in social organisms. Since we know that many species living in group and group living allow them to do a lot of function to maintain their life in the harsh environment. For instance, some species can breed cooperatively, and some can live together to fight against their predators, and some may foraging together to share information about their food. These behaviors are essential behaviors for them to cope with competition or to survival in the extreme environment. However, if the habitat loss have led to low population density of the species, and then in turn make them living in solitary, which prevent this essential behavior for them to cope with the competition in extreme environment. And to test these two hypotheses, I consider the burrowing beetles as my main study system. Burrowing beetles use the carcass of small mammals as their main breeding resource. And then once they found a carcass, they just bury it and use the carcass to feed their larvae. And their main resource competitor is the blowflies, which also lay eggs on the carcass, and then their maggots will consume the carcass and compete against the burrowing beetles. And then another feature of the burrowing beetles is that they breed cooperatively. One of our previous research have shown that the burrowing beetles can overcome the competition in warmer the competition from blowfly at lower elevation, which the temperature is warmer, and then the competition from blowfly is more intense. What we can easily imagine that in an intact forest, the population density of beetles is relatively high, and then they can freely move around the entire habitat. And once a carcass appear in the field, the beetle can soon form large cooperative group and successfully breed. However, in habitat with severe deforestation and habitat loss, the population density of beetles may be low, and then their movement may be impeded by the unsuitable habitat. And once the carcass appear, they can only form smaller cooperative group, and maybe that will lead them fail to reproduce. Okay, to test the hypothesis, we conduct field experiments in Mountain Hehuan in central Taiwan. The eastern slope of Mountain Hehuan is an intact forest well protected by Tailuge National Park. And however, the western slope of the mountain is heavily cultivated and suffering from heavy loss of forest. This provides us an excellent opportunity to test our hypothesis. Based on remote sensing data, we found that the forest cover on the western slope is significantly lower on the western slope, particularly at low elevation. And then, however, we monitor and record the mean daily temperature in the mean daily temperature in these two slopes, and we found there is no apparent difference in mean daily temperature in these two slopes. Next, we surveyed the population density of the burrowing beetle using this kind of people trap, and we found that on the western slope, the population density of beetles was lower, particularly at lower elevation, and then deforestation is responsible for the decrease of population density of burrowing beetles. Next, we conduct field breeding experiments for the burrowing beetles simply by providing carcass of rats in the field and let the wild beetles to freely access the carcass and breed. And then we found that in high population density sites, the beetles tend to form larger cooperative group in response to higher temperature. However, in low population density sites, the beetles just fail to cooperate. Next, we just try to identify the fitness consequence of this difference in behavior. We found that at high population density sites, the beetles can successfully breed even at high temperature. However, in low population density sites, they can only successfully breed when the temperature is relatively low. And since previous results are correlational, we also try to do some manipulative experiments in the field. We just performed the experiments on the western slope where the beetle population density is low. We manipulatively increase the population density of the beetles. And we found that, indeed, the increase of population density of beetle, the group size of the beetle, enable them to more successfully reproduce. Finally, to test the generality of our field, our empirical results, we also conduct a computer simulation using an individual-based model, and we simulate two kinds of habitat scenario. Yeah, we simulate two kinds of habitat scenario. One is the habitat with an intact habitat with 100% forest. The other is the habitat suffering from 30% forest loss. And then we we perform the simulation using the reproductive parameters and behavioral parameters of the beetles under under 20 degrees Celsius, which is a relatively harsh temperature for the beetles. And then the result shows that in the intact habitat, actually the burn beetle can successfully colonize the entire habitat. However, in the deforested habitat, in the 30% deforested habitats, the beetles can only distribute it sporadically and sparsely in relatively low proportion of the habitat, much lower than 70%. So our result shows that the decrease in forest in the landscape will lead to the decline in population density of the beetle, which in turn prevent them from cooperation. Finally, it will reduce their ability to cope with the competition in warmer environment. So our results also let us know that for conservation practice, it is important to protect enough habitat in the landscape to maintain the population density of organisms, which can let them to cope with the challenge from the changing climate. Okay, so this study is supported by by Academia Sinica and by Biodiversity Research Center and TIGP and various funding agents. And my study was also supported by many current and past members of our lab. I would like to thank them for their help. And finally, thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Shifan.